Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This week in Enterprise Tech, I'm Hyoun Park of Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. Hey, Charlie, how are you today?
I am good. It's raining here in New York City. I'm finally mostly not sick for the first time in 2 weeks, so that's always exciting. And it is turning out to be a very busy December. So in fact, both not personally with my work, but with just the news. I mean, we just spent 20 minutes almost trying to sort through everything to decide what we were going to talk about. So
That's right.
lots and lots to talk about.
Yeah, I'm waiting to throw out a lot of good stuff, frankly, that was just not going to fit into a half hour or more, possibly,
Oh, come on.
of,
We never
of
make it
news
into a half
review.
an hour.
Yes. Exactly. So, let's get straight to it. So obviously last week, Amazon reInvent happened. Amazon has become the biggest IT show of the year by many accounts, with whatever 60, 70,000 people swarming Las Vegas and taking over for the week. And if you tried to follow the press releases and announcements and blogs, you were probably just as overwhelmed as we were, trying to figure out among the 300 some things which things mattered most. But when we started digging into this from an AI and CIO perspective, there were definitely a few announcements that got our attention. So let's dig into some of the details. Actually, we're going to talk about some of the strategy later in the show, but let's start by digging into some of the functional things that really got our attention the most. Charlie, I know you had mentioned, for instance, you were looking at some of the things that happened with Amazon Connect and how that got your attention.
Well, I think so. Before we dive into the
Yeah.
specifics, I think that there's a couple of things that make it interesting. Make you reinvent always an interesting topic. I mean, the first is, we each had to sort through and we each picked different things, which I
Yes.
think is always, one of those signs that they're just covering so much ground, and they are. And secondly, I think that while clearly they are not truly agnostic, they've got a horse in the race. And you would look at the Microsoft and OpenAI sort of on the other end of the spectrum from an AI perspective. This is as close as we have to a horizontal industry conference these days,
Mhm.
as far as so many players play in the Amazon, the AWS ecosystem, that everyone is there. And I think because of that, and because they cover so much ground, it's really sort of an interesting bellwether as to where the market is going. And I think that's going to play into what we'll finish the show with. But specific to one of the ones that caught my eye was their announcement, wrong one, around Amazon Connect and bringing in some generative AI features, mostly because I had almost forgotten they even had this. So
Mhm.
Amazon Connect is their answer to basically CX. So it's a contact center tool. So it's if you look at the spectrum of what AWS does, is they provide a whole bunch of hardcore infrastructure, very very low level. They have sort of in the middle this abstraction layer where they try to provide a managed layer to sort of take out some of the complexity of hardcore infrastructure. Then they have a handful of apps like Amazon Connect, or what I would consider at the application layer, where they're, in this case, they're really competing with the five nines and the Genesises of the world.
Right.
And it's interesting because as you start looking at the world's converging, right? One of the touch points, the starting points for so many of the true Gen AI applications that are actually driving demonstrable and quantifiable value in the enterprise right now, it's in the contact center, right? We see Sierra having, coming out of stealth, and they've got, a unicorn evaluation right now, and founded by the former CEO of was he CEO of Salesforce or the co-CEO at Salesforce, and Brett Taylor, and so you have all this focus in this space. And what's interesting here is that AWS is clearly trying to leverage all of the work they're doing more broadly around AI and pull it into their Amazon Connect product and try to create a competitive beachhead from that. And I think that's really interesting, where they're connecting directly to Salesforce and doing a bunch of other things. They're leveraging Amazon Q as their conversational layer, all these different pieces. And so I think it's kind of just really interesting to see how this plays out, and as an example of where I think we're going to start seeing the battles fought at that AI application layer.
Yeah, the contact center has always been really difficult from an analytic perspective because it's simply impossible to manually review everything that happens in the contact center. There's always been a need for AI, both to assist the agent as well as to assist in the analysis of the customer experience. So this is an area where Amazon has actually been successful in selling an app. That this is an area that Amazon has really struggled at. Amazon has actually tried to get into the app space and app world in a bunch of different ways, and this is the one that has been most relevant.
Yep. So that was that one. Let's talk through some of these others. I'm just going to gloss over this. They talked about a new service that is attempting to address AI hallucinations. And what I thought was interesting about it is just that they are actually addressing it. They're not alone. There's other features. Microsoft has what they call correction. Google has, I forget what theirs is called, but they have a tool that allows it. But I think what is interesting, and we'll talk more about Bedrock here in a minute. What I think is interesting is AWS is introducing what they're calling automated reasoning checks, and it's being baked into the Bedrock suite. And I think this is important because where I think Amazon is placing a huge bet is on their ability to enable enterprise builders. And I think that this is targeted broadly, but I think specifically for the enterprise, I've been talking to a bunch of CIOs recently, and Bedrock has come up repeatedly. And so as CIOs and enterprises are looking at how they sort of divide the spectrum and say, what are they building? What are they buying? Even when they're building, they are returning to platforms like Bedrock. And in order to make that work, they need ways to prevent hallucinations. And so it made a lot of sense for them to bake this in. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting piece of it.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm concerned about anything that talks about being able to tackle AI hallucinations or reduce hallucinations, because I feel like a lot of what makes AI hallucinatory in nature is an individual person's perspective. And that is very hard to manage from a programmatic perspective or a developer perspective. And that's where Amazon has really shined. Amazon is really great at creating these individual technologies that can be brought together by the developer as foundational technologies, as part of a platform or as part of infrastructure. But hallucination by its own nature, by definition, is experienced by an individual based on an individual's perspective and their goals. And what one person might consider a hallucination, another person might consider important from a marketing portfolio perspective.
Well, yeah. So I guess we have to focus on. So let's clarify how they're attempting to do this, right? So, and this is actually, I think, its weakness is that there's a couple of different approaches to solving for hallucinations. Sometimes they're doing multiple model checks and a few other kind of approaches. What AWS is doing with automated reasoning is that they are having a customer supply cross-referenceable data, which it then validates again. So effectively defining the authoritative source of truth. So this is about like fact-checking kind of stuff. My concern is that part of the challenge that we're trying to use Gen AI to solve is to avoid the complexity when we don't actually know. we don't know what the authoritative data source is. And that's part of the problem. If we do, we just give someone a database. And so, that'll be the question is that does this create overhead? Does it actually solve the problem? But that is what they're trying to do with it. And I think to me, the big here wasn't that this is breakthrough technology or that it's all that amazing. To me, what is interesting is it is part of an entire quiver of arrows that I think AWS is trying to give to the enterprise to basically build in and bake these solutions for themselves.
Right. And there's actually a variety of things that AWS is doing on the AI side that are interesting. So along with looking at hallucinations, one of the things that got my attention was around how they're looking at multi-agent collaboration, which is an area that we're going to talk about again in a little bit. But the fact that AWS is already talking about how to bring agents within its own environment and have them independently work with each other on specific tasks, I think is an important step forward in tackling more complex logic and more complex jobs that typically require multiple roles and multiple skill sets within an organization. What I'm not convinced about there yet is how the testing will go, because it seems that when you have two agents working together, there's going to be a wide array of combinations that are potentially possible from a work perspective. And it would be useful to be able to test that in a speedy fashion. Right now, it looks like the testing is happening at an individual situation perspective. But even so, having that functionality, I think, is going to be one interesting piece of the puzzle. And then again, Bedrock is also looking at intelligent prompt routing and prompt caching, so that you can route prompts to the smartest or maybe the dumbest model that can potentially handle that prompt, depending on how good you want the answer to be, how much you want to spend on it. I think that's an interesting piece as well. So there's no real doubt or question why, Charlie, you're getting so many discussions around Bedrock right now. Bedrock is honestly an exciting piece of what Amazon is doing, and Amazon's keeping up with the Joneses on that regard.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, what neither of us, I just realized this, neither of us brought to the fold as far as one of the things to talk about is their introduction of Nova, right? So one of the things that has been very notable for AWS is they really haven't had a tier one model of their own, a foundation model. Right. And they introduced 6 versions of Nova, 2 of which were multimodal, a video generator, and I forget what the other one was, but that are in fact, receiving pretty good reception from people that are looking very deeply at the models, that these are stacking up fairly well. And so it's interesting. I think that the general consensus on the street seems to be that the sense that they had to do that, they had to have their own sort of layer. But I agree with you. I think Bedrock is going to, no pun intended, I guess, be their bedrock. It's going to be the foundation that they build this on. And if you compare this to what Microsoft announced with Ignite as an example, it is very clear that they are focused on the building blocks. They are focused on not providing an agent studio, which is what Microsoft really their sort of angle at the several layers of abstraction above this. This is about providing a set of tools that enable people to build these AI-based solutions. And so I actually love both of these. I love the multi-agent. I mean, we're going to talk about in a minute, part of the gap is that all of these solutions, and this is not unique to AWS, but it's focused, it's predicated on this idea that all the agents are living within that ecosystem. But I still think it's critically important that that layer of orchestration of being able to manage it and to create transparency around it is essential, and that's what they're doing. And then you mentioned the prompt routing and caching, again, absolutely critical. And I think you're absolutely right. It's less about the smarter and more about the dumber. It's being able to take a prompt and saying, what is the least cost path to resolve this? And that's a really difficult problem to solve, one that's going to be absolutely essential to any organization who's trying to roll out a technology and not, have unlimited funds to do so. So, super, super smart.
Yeah, I was on an IBM briefing this morning. They were talking about their AI models, their Granite models. And one of the interesting things they brought up in the roadmap is part of the roadmap is going down market, so to speak, down to, say, 30 million, 50 million parameter models. So they are trying to make more specific, smaller models that will be more efficient from a computing perspective at a time when some companies are talking about just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, Amazon is going to be able to support this as well with their Bedrock, SageMaker Studio. They obviously have a bunch of capabilities for supporting models and being able to switch out big and small models as needed.
Yeah, I get the other thing. I guess it's funny. I'm not sure where these are because I read all of this. I'm not sure. I'm sure I saved it. But the other big sort of announcement is that they made another big push on their own chips. And of course, we talked about previously their additional $4 billion investment in Anthropic, and part of that deal was Anthropic agreed to be using their chips. There was also an announcement with Apple that Apple's agreeing to use some of their chips, although not necessarily. It was a little opaque, so I don't think it's necessarily for the Apple Intelligence, but nevertheless, what you are really the big message here is you are seeing that AWS is trying to go, end to end on this, from the chip level all the way up, and to create these platforms to, for builders. And where I think their strength has always been is that, creating a very deep level of abstraction that allow you to not get in the nitty gritty, but still take advantage of their economies of scale and whatever. I'm a bit of an Amazon fan. I think they've done a great job, and they've been viewed as behind. And while I don't think they've caught all the way up, I think they are again right-minded in their approach. But they're definitely not perfect, as you have some critical words around their SageMaker announcements.
Yes. So SageMaker, one of their big announcements was the next generation of SageMaker, where they are bringing together SageMaker Studio, their Lakehouse, their data governance, their data processing, their Redshift data warehouse, as well as their QuickSight capabilities, and calling it all their SageMaker umbrella, which I find a little weird in that SageMaker has traditionally been seen as their data science platform, and honestly does not have a huge amount of uptake and traction compared to some of Amazon's other products. And we just spent 10 minutes talking about how fantastic Bedrock is and how all the exciting stuff right now is happening around Bedrock, Bedrock AI, Bedrock models, Bedrock routing, all these things that are really interesting. Like the things that are getting devs' attention right now are all around Bedrock. And then you bring the rest of your data stuff and you call it SageMaker. Like to me, that is a little weird. It's like
Yeah,
trying to bury
in the
all
run
that
up,
in the
you said
past.
in the run up, you equated it to IBM's use of Watson to try to maintain the name or the terminology. I agree. I think I agree in part. I think that part of the logic as they presented it anyway was that SageMaker has been their data platform, has been that sort of that brand, and that increasingly data and AI are being joined at the hip. And so you sort of see this evolving, that you have Bedrock. I don't know. They have all these stupid terms, right? So you have Bedrock, and then you have Nova. It's like, okay, well, so Nova are the models, Bedrock is the AI platform, and now you have SageMaker, the data platform. I couldn't imagine having to deal with the thousands of products they have and try to name them all and make all sense. So, I give them a little bit of grace on that. But yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that, the underlying point of the fact that data is an unquestionable first tier issue when you're trying to solve your AI problems is valid. And so trying to consolidate all of that into a brand, I think, makes some sense. But the question will be, can they get there, and can they rationalize? But as you pointed out, they still left Redis out there, and there's other parts. So
Yeah, and you've
we'll
got
see.
those chip names like Tranium and Inferentia. They sound like they're part of
Yeah.
a Bridgerton novel or something. I don't know. The Countess Inferentia.
So exactly. So I guess the big question, despite all this, is the one thing that AWS was consistent. Although they spent a lot of time talking about non-AI stuff, which I think a lot of people were sort of lauding. But clearly they spent a ton of time on AI. And one of the questions that I thought was interesting was an article by someone who I know we're both fans of, by the name of Casey Newton,
Mhm.
who wrote an article called "The Phony Comforts of AI Skepticism," and pointing out something that we on this show don't talk about a whole lot, but that is there is still a whole bunch of folks out there who sort of think that all this Gen AI stuff is overblown hype and isn't actually going to amount to everything that people report. And interestingly enough, I sort of have a foot in that camp. I mean, I think I've been fairly vocal in saying, "Hey, this stuff is a lot harder than it sounds, and we're going to have struggling with uptake." But it was interesting in this article just talking about people that are all but like, "Oh, this is all just complete bullshit," sort of
Mhm.
an approach, which I thought was interesting. So I'm curious what your take on this, and we can talk about where Casey landed, but what your take on this piece was.
Yeah, I thought it was a great piece exploring the different views on how AI is seen. I've definitely seen perspectives saying AI is nothing but basic autocomplete. Nobody should ever use it. We should ban it from schools. We should ban it from job interviews. We should make sure nobody is using AI if you're trying to figure out how somebody works or how somebody is using making skills or using skills. And then the other side saying that AI is going to take over humanity, general, artificial general intelligence, and Skynet, and all of the sky is falling, Chicken Little stories that are coming out there. And I think simply pointing out that there's somewhere in the middle where AI is still dangerous but also still useful is a valuable perspective, especially since we're really talking about the 2-year birthday of real generative AI being out in the masses. This is still this is still 1990s internet, honestly, from my perspective.
Yeah. I think we're very, very early, and I think you are correct. Like and maybe this is why I have my own blind spot. I sort of dismiss both sides of this. I dismiss the camp that says, "Oh, this is all complete BS," and I dismiss the camp that says this is existential threats to humanity. And so for me, the piece was it was useful for me because I looked at it and said, "Hey, let's acknowledge the people that are saying it's absolutely a complete hype and why they're doing it." But probably more important for me was recognizing, we need to probably put more focus on the existential side of this or the threat side of it, particularly because as we enter this era of the agentic AI, where now AI can take action. It was interesting in the article. He did two things I thought were very useful. One is he went through and identified a whole list of very wide ranging use cases that have demonstrable results out of Gen AI all over the place, healthcare, a bunch of very specific stuff. And I thought that was actually super useful because it's easy to get lost in the fact that it's just this conversational bot that can talk to you. But secondly, he pointed out that OpenAI in their latest release put a disclaimer or a note about testing that they said, and I'm just going to read it. It says, when O1 was led to believe that it would be shut down when acting on its goal and that its actions were monitored, it attempted to deactivate this oversight mechanism 5% of the time. When it found memos found by its developers that describe how it misaligned and will be superseded by a new model, it attempted to exfiltrate its weights and overwrite the new model 2% of the time. Now, right now, it can't do any of that, in terms of having the ability to take action, but we are like probably months away from it being able to actually initiate action, having direct access to things. So, it's like, that was like, holy crap, that really is sort of, I don't believe there's any intent, but it does speak to the fact that there is, something that's worth really paying attention to.
Yes, and we are working, going headlong forward into agentic AI, which is basically trying to get AI to actually do something when you prompt it. So the next step of seeing a model independently look at agents it has access to, and then perhaps take action without independent review, it's going to happen. Probably, I mean, not on purpose, but it's going to happen at some point, and we're going to have to start figuring out how to create those types of fail safes as well. That's very realistic to me. I've never seen computing go exactly as planned, where every single silo and every single piece of governance stayed true 100% from start to finish throughout an era of computing.
Well, we don't have time to spend much more time on it, but I highly recommend you read the article. It's very thought provoking and worth looking at. Moving on to some industry news, we have a handful of kind of quick hits here that are companies doing interesting stuff. One is a company called Emergence AI, and they're introducing what they're calling their multi-agent AI orchestrator. I think that's what they're calling it.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about AWS, and they're having multi-agent orchestration sort of baked in. But one of the things that Emergence is making a point about here is that they're able to do this across platforms, and I think that's an important thing that most of these ecosystems right now are not doing well. And there's a quote from, I think, their CEO, that talks about the fact that autonomous agents are exciting, but must be deterministic because enterprises won't deploy something that works 95% of the time. And I think that's incredibly valid. I'm not sure that I believe that their orchestrator agent's actually solving for that necessarily, but I believe in the sentiment and I believe directionally. So I thought it was quite interesting and an important step, and I think we're going to see more of this.
Yes, in general, I think that because of the extreme fragmentation and splintering that we have of data sources and apps, that we still, for now, need this middle layer of data integration, application integration, and now agent, at least cataloging and sorting. So I can see the use for Emergence as a third party, because just thinking about how Microsoft's going to have its own agents. Salesforce is going to have its own agents. NetSuite, Workday, on and on. SAP, Oracle, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody is going to have their own sets of agents that are going to be independently conducting some sort of action within your organization, and then playing with that golden record that we like to think about as the core data in our organization that we do have to keep clean and consistent. So all of that, keeping those transactions and that data clean without a holistic view of agents is going to be really difficult to do. So
I think it's going to be the
yeah.
big question, actually, that like if you're a CIO right now, I think you need to be thinking about this because there's going to be this decision point because the ServiceNows and the Salesforces of the world are going to make the case that they can deliver an agentic architecture that can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still going to be residing in their system. And do you have enough faith, or do you, if you want to have platform independence where you may want to change platforms at some point in the future, do you want it all in, all those eggs in one basket? I mean, it's going to be a question that I think, and I know, like I said, I've been talking to a lot of CIOs lately, and I'd say they're landing like half and half, where some go, yeah, that's a major concern, and others say, no, it makes more sense to have everything in one place. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how Emergence does with this, and because it's like a very narrow niche, right? It's just
Yes.
one thing, but
At the same time, other than ServiceNow, all and somewhat to Microsoft, most of these other companies don't really want to get into your core IT. Salesforce doesn't want to become an IT
yeah,
vendor. These companies don't want to become basically call it Informatica. Informatica is totally a hardcore IT vendor, although they have some master data stuff that is line of business. Mostly they are tough, strong IT focused vendor, and that's not really where Salesforce wants to go or Workday wants to go at the end of the day.
definitely not Workday. I'm not sure I'm convinced about Salesforce. We'll see how this continues to play out. But all right, other news. There's a company called Exa taking a super unique approach. No idea if it's going to work or what it even actually translates to, but we've been spending a lot of time talking about AI based search. So the fight, the battle going on between Google and the likes of Perplexity and U.com, and now OpenAI has their search. And it's this, and there is Google famously did their, what are they called, their red flag alert or whatever it was called, right, to say this was an existential threat with AI. Interestingly, I was watching this podcast where a bunch of VCs were sort of playing like a football or baseball draft where they were picking teams with different companies, and one of them went basically was sorting or bearish on Perplexity because they were reporting that they looked at the actual usage numbers and it's still like a sliver, despite people like us in tech that are using it. But in another case, I think what's interesting, the Exa is almost sidestepping this entire conversation because their premise, and you're more technical, maybe you can explain it better, but their premise is that they are using what are called embeddings to effectively take every web page out there and to convert it into a metadata structure like a database might function. And so when you're doing a search, it's not actually searching via keywords, it's actually using this deconstructed model to figure out what you're looking for. And the result is I can now ask it a question like, give me a list of the top 100 companies by revenue or something, and it just goes and builds me a table that has that data. I didn't fully get it myself, but that was the idea.
Yeah, so I love this idea because for decades we have been counting on indexes and spiders to figure out how to do search over the web, and this is steadily declining as Google has lost their way and started messing up the search experience. And here's Exa coming in and saying, well, we're going to organize the web more from a language-based perspective. We're going to use the same type of logic that we're starting to embrace from a generative AI perspective and see and look at the web from that perspective. So it's both rebuilding the web search infrastructure as well as potentially providing more accurate results and doing something a little bit different from what Perplexity is looking at as well. So surprisingly, despite the fact that we're trying to break up Google search right now as a monopoly, it seems like new competitors are legitimately coming in with better mousetrap and opportunities to support a new type of search. And we'll see if they catch on, but they're at least providing Google, a run for their money in terms of having to catch up in the search space.
Well, and it is important to note that they are not actually going after the traditional search space in the way you would think about it. I mean, one of the things about this particular approach is it is LLM based underneath the covers, and it's doing this very intricate sort of reasoning model using this data structure that is bet. So the founder talks about how you type in your query and then go get a cup of coffee because it's going to take a while.
Right.
So it's not really this direct competitor to the way we think of the mundane kind of questions we ask. But I think I think we talked about this last week, as I think some of that starts going to the true generative AI, where I just ask the random question, it spits out an answer. This is the counterpoint where I think the current Perplexity type approaches struggle with that much deeper kind of question, where I'm trying to really mine data that's sitting on the internet to figure out what's going on. And that's what this is trying to solve. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see if it catches on, if this becomes a tail wagging the dog and Google starts doing some of this sort of stuff.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of skipped a step with search because I feel like the importance of search isn't just being able to say, I'm looking for this, here's a website, but being able to say, here's a topic. I want it to be well documented with all of the potential sources that are coming into place, and being able to weigh how important those sources are and how how those sources are verified, and then being able to work with that across the entire internet. And I see X taking a better approach there. So Will Brick and his team, congrats on really tackling this problem.
Yeah, very interesting. And speaking of problems to be tackled, another announcement from a company called AI Illuminate introduced what they're calling first of a kind benchmark on large language model safety, I guess, right? So, I mean, you brought this one up. What was your take on this one?
Yeah, so we've been trying to figure out how to benchmark LLMs across a variety of areas. And so AI Illuminate, MLCommons, is taking on this, looking at various aspects of hazards. So things that we are trying to protect our users from, whether they be mentions of suicide or sex crimes or hate crimes or intellectual property issues around trademark and patent, providing advice that may not be regulated, say looking for medical or legal advice from an LLM that is not licensed to provide that. This is MLCommons is providing a framework that looks at all of at least a number of major LLMs and figures out whether they are average or above average or below average in terms of each of these areas. And they're looking at things like Anthropic Claude, they're looking at GPT, they're looking at Llama, Mistral, they're looking at a bunch of the generally used LLMs at this point. So I think it's good that at least one benchmark is out here to start looking at how these actual models actually compare to each other in terms of potentially distributing harm in their outputs.
Yeah, I do think it's yet another sign that we're moving past pure experimentation and we're moving into production, and people are looking at these things more carefully. I don't know if we talked about on the show or not, but there's another benchmark that came out that was trying to look at real world use cases. And so just trying to move past the very technical sort of way we've been benchmarking models.
Mhm.
I think this is another good example of that. And I
Yeah,
think it's
we've
a good
had too
thing. I
much
think
of
it's
93.2 versus 92s in responding to a specific question, and like nobody knows what that means.
what I do think is interesting about this, and to me, it's a question mark. So when, as I mentioned, I've been talking to a lot of CIOs recently, and what I heard a ton of is very strong concerns about governance and security, privacy. Didn't hear a lot about this, right? A lot of this sort of concern. And so I'm curious if it's just because we're still so early in the production cycle that this hasn't, been something that's hit the wall yet, or if people just aren't caring about it or accepting it. That's part of the beast. But I think that will be the big question mark for me is how does this sort of get traction as far as a concern for the enterprise?
Yeah, and I think part of it is that, frankly, every large language model has a little bit of governance already to avoid the absolute worst outcomes that can happen, and in most cases, that works. It's these 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000 occurrences that really go viral. And honestly, there haven't been enough of those yet to make CIOs think, but it doesn't mean that those governance issues aren't there.
Yeah, or we won't have a big whatever that causes them to pay attention.
Yes.
Speaking of big whatevers that cause them to pay attention, we have a big whatever sort of unfolding in South Korea that may cause CIOs to become very well versed in South Korean politics, as it has at least the potential to really threaten some of the chip supply chains. I mean, this is something that's sort of near and dear to your heart. I mean, what's your take on all of that?
Sure. So being Korean, I noticed last week while everybody else was at Amazon reInvent that there was a military coup in South Korea. The president literally tried to take over with the military. The legislature immediately came back into session and said, no, you can't do that, unanimous vote, and everything kind of stood down. So from an IT perspective, you're like, okay, whatever, global politics, but how's that affect me? Like, the practical aspects are that there are a lot of Asian countries that are providing a lot of compute and storage and memory and capabilities that affect your supply chain. In Korea's case, Korea provides 60% of memory chips in the world. So obviously, anything that happens in Korea that stops that from happening or threatens that is going to be an issue. Fortunately, in this case, this is an issue where memory is considered a bipartisan issue in Korea, keeping those open. However, there is a government. There is separately has been a worker strike in Korea based on complaints to the government, and not having a government is worse in that regard because it is harder to fix up that strike. And this is going to be one of these little things where you should be aware there's an ongoing strike and a poorly functioning government right now that may come to loggerheads when it comes to supply chain for memory. And so that's bad enough for Korea. But I think it's also important to think about this from other countries as well. Like, obviously, we count on Taiwan for actually building AI chips. We count on several countries, other countries in Asia, of course, Japan, but also Malaysia, Singapore, a lot of other countries that are handling bits and pieces of our IT supply chain. And unfortunately, the politics that happen in those countries will affect our ability to actually be able to buy servers and buy cloud at the end of the day.
Yeah, I was actually shocked reading that Korea produced 60% of memory chips. I mean, I was aware of the dominance of Taiwan, concerned about that given the whole situation with China.
Mm-hmm.
But this one was sort of like an off radar thing for me. So, it just speaks to the fact if you're a CIO today, you need to, in case you didn't have enough to worry about, you need to be paying attention to some of the geopolitical issues. And I think it's also, we didn't bring this one up either, but there's another report out that Apple, as an example, is very actively looking at how they can move some of their production facilities out of China. They're right now looking mostly to India. But I think we're going to start seeing more of this, where historically we were in a time of stability that organizations were generally fine with this sort of heavy consolidation and concentration. of specific factor or specific form factors in places like South Korea and Taiwan, I think there's going to be a much greater prevalence of people trying to diversify it, and it's going to complicate things. So
yeah, I remember seeing the CIO stories back in the call it mid 2000s when the Russian oligarchs were taking over, and CIOs were literally pulling out servers in the middle of the night and leaving Moscow. And hopefully that won't be the case again, but you might have to take a page out of that old playbook in a country or two. Like we're coming into some weird, wild times.
well, and to that end, I think I think complexity is the new name of the game, and we're definitely not the only ones to be thinking that or seeing it. Werner Vogel, the CTO of AWS, maybe just Amazon overall, I'm not sure. He traditionally closes out reInvent, sort of talking to the builders themselves. This is where the things tend to get more practical. Last year, he famously talked about the need to be focused on cost. I know you got very happy with the whole focus on FinOps. And this year, he is talking about complexity is inevitable and created a brand new word, I think anyway, Simplexity.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, but basically the premise of his talk was, I think there were a handful of sort of axioms that he sort of threw out. And the first is that we have to acknowledge that complexity is inevitable. I fully agree with that. I've said that for a long time, that it is the new standard, that as a result of that, you need to be planning for failure. This is something he's been saying for a long time. And that as you do that, then it actually decreases your chance of failure, one of the core ethos of AWS altogether. But probably the part that I found most interesting is something that I think is easy to kind of lose in this conversation, and that is that there are two types of complexity. And he pointed
Mhm.
out to this idea of intended complexity, which is something that I talk about a lot, where you have to have complexity to solve the business challenges that they're facing. But then he also talks about the unintended complexity, effectively the, this is my word, the laziness or the inattentiveness to the systems and the intertwined complexity of all of this. Um, in which it's woven into and sort of sneaks into the architectural decisions. And this is the classic technical debt conversation, right? And it ends up slowing you down, making systems harder to maintain. And so his sort of call to action was to discern this. You can't use the fact that we live in this complex environment as a scapegoat. You need to distinguish between these two and root out this unintended complexity and embrace the intended complexity, but then focus on how you manage that. And I just thought, it was all the talk about AI and all the talk about super hype. I love that this was just very pragmatic and talking to the reality on the ground that CIOs and enterprise IT leaders need to be dealing with.
Yes, it reminds me of Nassim Taleb's concept of anti-fragility, where he talks about complexities that work together to reinforce each other rather than being one-offs that are difficult to manage. And I think this speaks to why we are digging back into data quality and data assurance and data management to such an extent, because we have to go back to basics, what Amazon would call primitives, and figure out what are the right solid building blocks to build this next generation of technology. Because as fantastic as it is to be able to talk to our data now, it doesn't mean much if our data isn't clean. So we have to figure out how to get those building blocks back in place before we start now building a layer of agents on top of that, and then whatever comes after that.
Yeah, it's funny. My I think I've probably mentioned on here before. My dad in the 1980s ran SWAT teams, and he had this phrase that slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? With this idea that you have to focus on effectively this blocking and tackling. That if you try to focus on all the fancy tactics, then you just sort of get yourself wrapped around the axle. And I think when it comes to IT, almost universally, it's the same thing. Every time I talk to a CIO that has truly been effective and successful, the answer is almost the same. They got the basics right. They have the blocking and tackling. They focus on those primitives, as Amazon would call it. And by doing that, it gives them the flexibility to adapt and to shift and to change. And I think the only part I would say that's different is that it used to be the way we did that is we did all that rationalization. We removed the complexity. And now we have to recognize that elements of that complexity are not removable. They have to exist because of the nature of the business. Then AI is just amping that up even further. And so now it's about how do you discern between those two. So I thought it was great. I thought it was, in my opinion, the highlight of the show. Honestly, it almost always is. Just to try to bring this all back to reality and addressing the actual, the truth of what
Yeah.
is really going on.
Werner Vogels is one of the few guys who truly lives up to the hype every single time. And that's a really hard bar in a world of extreme hype in the tech world.
And to the other end of the spectrum, we always try to land on a sort of a lighter note. And I don't even know what to say about this one. So this word came out. Look at the date here this week, I guess. But Broadcom basically has now announced that nope, just joking. They're not really going to take their 2,000 top accounts, all really their entire major set of enterprise deals, and bring them in house. They're only going to keep the top 500, and they're going to push the other 1,500 back out to their partner community, because they finally got wind that, oh, these customers might actually have options and change paths, and now they're trying to salvage it. And it was sort of, I mean, we talked about it at the time. It's like, yeah, duh.
Yeah.
So,
It's amazing how Broadcom thought they could simply push this extreme price hike and not have enterprises react. So kudos to Canalys, great analyst firm focused on the channel. I love their work. And kudos to Alistair Edwards for pointing out that this recent change has been happening, and that basically it was a mistake for Broadcom to just try to grab the top 2,000 VMware customers, take them away from their channels, take them away from their support, and just try to jack up the prices. So, I expect, frankly, we are also in a time when vendors are being pushed to be greedier and to push for profits. Obviously, we are in a profit-driven environment, which is fine. That's how capitalism works. But I feel like there's an increased focus and on the vendor side to see what they can get away with on the price side. And I think this might be a time for enterprises to build consortiums, be smart about how they are answering vendor requests. Definitely talk to your peers right now about what they are seeing in the market, and don't just accept price hikes where they may lie. It's a good time to talk to procurement, because they might be thinking, well, we've got this price hike, but you said this was mission critical. So, we've got to go along with it and just do what we can. This is a time for procurement and finance and IT to team up, because you're facing big forces also teaming up against you on the pricing side.
well, I also think there was a really big miscalculation here. I mean, we are long in the tooth on people like Oracle and SAP being incredibly sticky, right?
Mm-hmm.
But part of the reason they're so sticky is that their products are so embedded into the workflow that forget the cost of the technology. The cost of changing is just
Mm-hmm.
so exorbitant that it makes it really, really difficult to justify that. And I think Broadcom was sort of counting on that same idea that, oh, this was this intrinsic part of it. What I think they missed is at this level of the infrastructure, it's in such a state of flux anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a difficult calculation for a CIO to go, well, look, I'm going to have to refresh this technology in the next 2 to 3 years anyway. So why am I going to sit here and take this when I can start looking at other options? And there's such an abundance. We just spent, half an hour talking about reInvent,
Right.
all of these options to just completely re-architect things that gave them options, particularly with the hybrid models that are sort of emerging. And so I think it was a gross miscalculation. We talked about it at the time. And I don't think it's going to kill anything in the short term, but I think they've probably severely damaged themselves over the long haul.
Yeah, this is just begging for enterprises to further review what they're doing with Kubernetes, whether they should keep that data center open, whether they should be looking more deeply at Amazon, Microsoft, Google, or even Oracle or IBM as other cloud options, if depending on what you're trying to do, or whether we should just put certain workflows back onto our mainframe that seem to be, the old gray mare that just happened to be doing quite well handling this specific work case. You're begging for companies to do that when you jack up the prices and add millions of dollars to their bills. Because honestly, every Fortune 500 enterprise has the capability to practically do everything themselves. They choose not to because they think they can work faster by paying a bit more to do it with the portfolio of IT services that they have. But when you're talking about these Fortune 500 companies, they have $1 billion to spend on IT, and trying to push them and jack up another $100 million is enough to get their attention and have them say, hey, why should we bother dealing with you?
Yeah, and and you need to at least like give some face time, some like an effort that says you're trying to be relevant and competitive. I mean, I'll be the first to give Oracle and SAP crap about some of their policies, but the reality is, they're both investing in innovation. They're both trying to evolve and show, how they can help their organizations in the future. And I just feel like Broadcom's not doing any of that. And it's just if I'm the CIO today, it just is it's a really tough pill to swallow. And I think that's, it's coming to roost.
Yep. Oof. On that tough note, we mean it with love. We hope you take this with the love that we sent it with. But on that note, thanks for joining us again. This has been This Week in Enterprise Tech. If you enjoyed this conversation or want to hear more, just feel free to like, subscribe, comment, and send some notes over to us.